Whispers, slurs, silence. At Crestmoor Academy, two black sisters are pushed past their limits until one brutal morning they fight back. What follows shakes the school, ignites a scandal, and brings a privileged family crashing down. Some stories demand to be told. This one refuses to be ignored. The early morning sunlight stretched across the courtyard of Crestmoor Academy, reflecting off the tall glass windows of the main building, casting a golden shimmer on the red brick walls. Everything about this place exuded tradition and power, from the meticulously trimmed trees and pristine stone pathways to the silent white statues standing watch across the campus like ancient gods, quietly observing every step. Avery and Autumn Johnson stood side by side at the front gate, their uniforms crisp, backs straight, chins held high. But behind their eyes, both could feel it, that creeping chill slipping through the cracks in the brick walls, seeping into their skin, even though the early autumn air was still gentle. That first step through the intricately wrought iron gate wasn't just a step into a new school. It was a step onto a battlefield, one they couldn't yet see but already felt. The stares began almost immediately, not curious, but scrutinizing, foreign, judging. Students gathered in small clusters across the yard. The hum of chatter slowed, then stopped. Some whispered just loud enough to be overheard. Others simply glanced their way before turning with subtle smirks, small enough to deny, sharp enough to wound. Avery felt every gaze pass over her natural curls, pulled neatly behind her head, linger on her warm brown skin, then land on the stiff Crestmoor crest stitched into her blazer. Her fingers tightened around her backpack strap, just enough to stop her hands from trembling with anger. Beside her, Autumn remained composed, but her fingers were clenched so tightly her knuckles turned pale. It wasn't the first time they'd been looked at like this, but this time felt different. Deeper, colder, like they'd stepped into a place not built to welcome them. Not because they were new, not because they were twins, but because they were black. And at Crestmoor, that alone was enough to set them apart. Look at that. Walking in like a set, a boy's voice rang out from the side, making no effort to lower the volume. I thought this was an academy, not a runway. A few chuckles followed. Autumn glanced over, eyes sharp as a blade, but her lips remained closed. They'd been taught not to react until it mattered. Their father, Malcolm Johnson, had warned them, had prepared them. But no amount of preparation made this any easier. Just keep walking, Avery murmured, more for both of them than for one. Autumn gave a slight nod, and they moved forward, stepping across a stone courtyard like two currents flowing against a river frozen by prejudice. The brick walls said nothing, but they were watching, and deep within the halls of this so-called prestigious institution, the undercurrents had begun to stir. The first day passed like a shallow scratch, but by the second week, the cuts had begun to draw blood. Avery and Autumn quickly learned that at Crestmoor, discrimination didn't always come in the form of shouting or slurs. It lived in the accidental shoulder bumps in the hallway, in the sneers that made them feel like stains on an otherwise spotless cloth. It echoed in every classroom they entered, where their names were always mispronounced or left out altogether. Ah, you two. Johnsons, right? Twins. Mr. Taylor, the math teacher, flipped quickly through the attendance sheet, his tone flat, like reciting an outdated news report. He never looked up, not once, not even a glance. In the polished rows of wooden desks, Chase Whitmore lounged comfortably in the third row, one foot propped on his designer backpack beneath the desk. That familiar half-smile never left his face, the kind of smile worn by someone who knew he'd never be punished, because he'd only ever lived at the top of the pyramid. Next to him sat Tyler Graves and Logan Price, his most loyal shadows, never far, always echoing his empty laughter. At lunch, Avery and Autumn chose a table near the window, far from the noisy center crowd. But distance didn't mean safety. Every time Chase walked past, he made sure to drop a comment, just loud enough for everyone to hear, but never quite clear enough to be called out. So, the school's letting in transfers from the other side of town now, he said one afternoon, his eyes settling on Autumn sneakers. Tyler chimed in, grinning, "Look at that. Discount kicks. Must have gotten in on a full ride or something." The laughter that followed was like the sound of shattering glass. Not loud, but sharp enough to slice pride right down the middle. Autumn clenched her spoon. She didn't respond. Avery simply looked at her sister, her eyes like a thin thread keeping a rising fire stitched inside a calm face. But worse than the mockery was the silence. No one stepped in. No teacher said a word when Tyler accidentally slammed into Avery, knocking her books across the hall. No one asked when Autumn walked into class with soak stained down her back because someone had accidentally poured water on her chair before she arrived. Everyone just kept walking. Silence isn't neutral. Silence is complicity. The sisters understood that well. They carried the nameless bruises home every night. And when their father, Malcolm Johnson, looked into their dimmed eyes, he knew, even if they hadn't said a word. "They're testing your limits," he said, voice deep like wind through the pine trees behind the house. "And they won't stop. Not until they think you've broken." Autumn met her father's gaze, and for the first time in days, her eyes lit with fire. "Well, they guessed wrong," she said softly, but her voice landed like stone. "They don't know who we are." And somewhere in the quiet darkness of that still night, while the school continued as if everything were normal, a storm began to form, born from silence, and from hearts that would no longer endure. The Johnson home sat at the end of a quiet street on the outskirts of Hawthorne Springs. Every afternoon, when Avery and Autumn stepped to the black iron gate, it was like crossing into a different world, a world with rules, with discipline, and with one man who missed nothing, Malcolm Johnson. He was a quiet man with eyes sharp as a razor and the lean, controlled build of a fighter, still intact even past 40. Behind the house, the old garage had long been converted into a training space. Polished wooden floors, a full-length mirror lining one wall, a punching bag hanging squarely in the center, and a whiteboard in the corner with faded words that still read clearly, "Control is strength." That day, when Autumn threw her gloves aside and struck the bag with such force it swayed violently, Malcolm said nothing at first. He just watched. Avery, nearby, wiped the sweat from her brow, glancing between her sister and their father, waiting. "You're letting anger lead," Malcolm finally said, his voice calm. "Do you know what happens when emotion controls a punch?" Autumn turned, sweat streaming down her forehead, her eyes still burning. "It loses accuracy." Malcolm nodded, "and becomes easy to counter. A strong but wild hit is a window for the weak to strike back." He stepped forward, steadied the bag in the center of the floor again, then turned to his daughters. "Crestmoor isn't a place where you'll be treated fairly. But that's not a reason to respond like someone weak. They want to see you break. They want to make you into the image they've already drawn of you. So don't give them that satisfaction." Autumn bit her lip, then let out a long breath. "So what do I do when all I want is to punch them in the face?" Malcolm chuckled softly, a rare sound. "Train. Stay calm. And when the moment comes, if you have to respond, make sure it's a calculated strike. One that lands not just physically, but leaves them unable to stand back up, mentally and emotionally." He turned, pointing to the whiteboard, where the phrase "control is strength" stood bold like a silent oath. "You're not strong because you can hit," he said. "You're strong because you know when to hit and when to walk away." The room fell quiet for a beat. Avery nodded, her gaze returning to a place of stillness. Autumn lowered her head, her fingers still gripping her gloves like she was holding on to something deeper than power, something like restraint, pride, and the wisdom her father passed down day after day. When the training session ended, the three of them sat together on the wooden floor, their breathing slowly returning to calm. Outside, the sunset cast a suburban sky in a warm red glow, slipping to the arched window and stretching in long, silent streaks across the floorboards. And in that light, one thing was clearer than ever. They weren't just a family. They were a fortress, silent, steady, and always ready. Monday morning began like any other. Soft sunlight spilled to the tall glass windows of Crestmoor Academy, catching the gleam of the silver crests pinned to students' uniforms. But as Avery and Autumn stepped into the main hallway, their footsteps froze. Right in front of them, two steel lockers, lined against the wall like every other, were now covered in jagged red spray paint. vicious words, crude, mocking symbols. And at the top, someone had scrawled two cartoonish faces in black ink, thick lips, wild hair, drooping eyes, a cruel, grotesque caricature straight out of racist television skits from decades past. The hallway went silent for one breathless second. Then it exploded with laughter. Not innocent laughter, but the long, cheap, stinging kind. The kind that slices through dignity like a knife. Avery stood frozen, her face stretched tight, ready to break. Autumn beside her clenched her backpack strap, so hard her knuckles turned bone white. Their breaths were slow, heavy, like they were holding back a scream. But even in silence, everyone saw, everyone looked, and no one, not one person, stepped forward. At the far end of the hall, Chase Whitmore leaned casually against his locker, arms crossed, eyes full of smug satisfaction. Beside him, Tyler and Logan laughed openly, as if they'd just watched the morning's best comedy show. "Just trying to brighten things up," Chase called out loudly, voice dripping with mock concern. "School needs a little color, don't you think?" The hallway rang again with laughter. Some students lowered their heads. Some pulled out phones to take pictures. No one said a word. No one pushed back. Silence won again, and it echoed louder than any shout could. Autumn stepped forward, her hands trembling, but her eyes still icy. She pulled a tissue from her bag and began wiping the red paint, but it didn't come off. It had soaked into the metal, like a stain seeping into pride. A janitor walked by. A young teacher passed, too. Both glanced. Both kept walking. No questions. No words. "Don't wipe it," Avery whispered, her voice tight with emotion. Not because it won't come off, but because today they cross a line. Autumn paused, eyes meeting her sister's. And in that moment, inside the frozen walls of isolation, something cracked, not submission, but resolve. After school, when the crowds had gone, the two girls returned to the hallway. Quietly, together, they carried water, soap, and paper towels from the restroom. One swipe at a time, they began to clean the lockers, not out of shame, but because they refused to let anyone else define their dignity with the language of cowards. That evening at dinner, Malcolm listened as his daughters recounted every detail. There was no anger in his expression, no complaints, no raised voice. When Autumn finished, he simply looked at them both and nodded slowly. "Tomorrow," he said, "if they take one step further, then you already know, silence ends. It's time to respond, in the language they understand." The next morning, the atmosphere on the Crestmoor Academy campus was heavy, thick as lead. The usual whispers that floated lazily from group to group had now gathered into a wave, rolling across the courtyard. Everyone knew. Everyone was waiting. It felt like the entire school was holding its breath, wondering whether the two black girls would hang their heads or disappear like defeated, humiliated ghosts. But Avery and Autumn Johnson didn't hang their heads. And they didn't run. They stepped on the courtyard just as they always did. Uniforms neat, eyes forward, stride unwavering. But this time, there was something different in their gaze. The calm stillness before a storm. Chase Whitmore was already there, as if perfectly timed and placed, ready to direct the grand finale of the drama he'd orchestrated. Tyler and Logan flanked him like two smug pillars, ready to back him up. Dozens of students gathered around the courtyard, phones already raised, ready to capture whatever came next. "Well, look who still showed up," Chase called out, his voice half laugh, half taunt. "After yesterday's little performance, I figured you'd have enough dignity to just disappear." Avery didn't answer. She stopped a few feet away, her eyes locked on his smug expression. Autumn stood beside her, quietly lowering her backpack onto the stone path, lightly, like laying down a burden. No one spoke, but everyone felt it, like static thick in the air, just waiting for one spark to burn it all down. "Ah, look at that. Statues now," Logan sneered. "You waiting for an apology?" Tyler added. "Or for Daddy to come save you?" Autumn stepped forward half an inch, but Avery reached out, her hand gently touching her sister's. Just one small gesture. "Wait, time it right." But Chase didn't wait. He stepped up and slammed his shoulder into Avery's. "Get the hell out of our school." No more words were needed. In less than a second, Avery turned. Fluid as running water, she caught his arm mid-motion and twisted it behind his back with precision, not enough to break it, but enough to drop him to his knees. A scream tore through the courtyard. Logan lunged first, swinging like an amateur. Autumn ducked low, dodged a punch, and swept his back leg hard, sending Logan sprawling face first onto the stone. His chin hit with a crack that silenced the entire crowd. Tyler roared, charging forward. But before he could reach either of them, Avery spun and drove a clean side kick into his midsection. He staggered back, gasping, then collapsed onto grass. It was over in under 15 seconds. Not a single scream from the Johnson sisters. Not a single wasted move. Every step, every strike was precise, not rebellion, but performance honed through years of discipline. Avery released Chase's trembling arm. He collapsed to the ground, clutching his shoulder, face pale as paper. Autumn stood beside him, calm and composed. She leaned down slightly, her eyes steady. "We're not here to be anyone's backdrop," she said, her voice cutting through the now silent courtyard. "And if you plan on coming back for more, make sure next time you can get back up." No one laughed. No one kept filming. Crestmoor Academy had just witnessed something it never expected. The girls they looked down on had risen, and no one would knock them down again. That evening, the Johnson household was unusually quiet. At the dinner table, the soft golden light above cast a warm glow over the room. The plates of food sat cooling, untouched, as all three of them remained lost in thought, still orbiting the schoolyard battlefield. Autumn, sitting at one end, gently dabbed a cloth across a scrape on her wrist, where she'd use her forearm to take Logan down. Across from her, Avery sat silently, slowly rotating a glass of water in her hand. Between them, Malcolm Johnson rested his forearms on the table, eyes fixed out the window, where a black SUV had just driven past their house for the third time. "You think they'll come here?" Avery asked quietly. Her tone wasn't fearful. It was confirmation. Malcolm didn't turn his head. "Not them. Their parents." Autumn sighed and set the cloth down. "Good. I like to see the faces of the people who raised someone like Chase." Malcolm nodded slightly. Then he rose from the table and walked toward the living room, where the front door sat just barely ajar. But he didn't lock it. Not because he was careless. Because he was ready. And then, just as he expected, 3 sharp knocks rattled the door. He opened it before anyone could speak. The light from inside poured across the furious face of Victoria Whitmore. Her carefully combed blonde hair now fell wild in the wind, though she still clung to elegance by resting her sunglasses atop her head like a makeshift crown. Beside her stood Richard Whitmore, broad, square-jawed, his eyes bloodshot with rage. "Who do you think you are?" Victoria hissed, skipping past civility. "My son is injured. I just picked him up from the nurse's office. And you're in here sipping tea like nothing happened?" Malcolm didn't reply. He stepped back, opened the door wide. "Come in," he said calmly. "If you're here to talk, then talk like grown-ups." "We're not here to make small talk," Richard snarled, his fist clenched tight. "I came to tell you, if you don't teach your daughter some respect, I will." Avery and Autumn had stepped behind their father at some point. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. They knew this fight wasn't theirs. Malcolm stepped fully onto the porch, facing the large man now rolling up his sleeves like he was ready to brawl. "You think strength lives in your fists?" Malcolm asked, his voice calm as a still lake. "You're mistaken." Richard growled and swung, but Malcolm caught his wrist in a single breath. With one smooth turn of his body, he twisted and flipped Richard onto the wooden porch like a sandbag dropping from a shelf. A sickening thud. The porch rattled. Victoria screamed, but no one moved to stop her. Autumn stepped forward, her voice cold and sharp. "You taught your son to look down on others. Now do you see where that leads?" Malcolm didn't strike again. He stood over the man gasping on the ground and said evenly, "We didn't start this, but if you bring it to our doorstep, don't expect to walk away standing tall." Red and blue lights began flashing at the end of the street. Malcolm didn't look. He turned calmly, walked into the kitchen and poured himself another glass of water. Out on the porch, Victoria's voice shook as she dialed 911, still rattling with fury. Richard lay groaning, still unable to get to his feet. Inside the Johnson home, the three of them returned to the dinner table. No one spoke, but in their eyes there was a quiet peace, one that even sirens couldn't break. Less than 10 minutes later, 2 white and blue patrol cars pulled up the curb in front of the Johnson home. The spinning light swept across the tree branches, casting flickering shadows onto the porch like a temporary stage, where the truth was finally ready to step into the spotlight. Avery and Autumn sat calmly on the living room sofa, eyes steady, watching the still open front door. Malcolm stood tall at the threshold, arms relaxed at his sides, face carved in quiet stone, resolute, unmoved. The car door opened. A middle-aged officer stepped out. Salt and pepper hair. Clean cut. Solid build. The name stitched on his badge. Monroe. "Good evening," he said, his voice deep but even. "I'm Detective Monroe. I receive a report on assault at this address." Victoria Whitmore immediately lunged toward him, hands flying as if trying to redraw the scene with sheer outrage. "Sheriff Monroe, they attacked my husband. They assaulted my son at school, and now this at his house? You have to arrest them right now." Monroe didn't flinch. He glanced at Richard, who was now being helped off the ground by another officer, his face contorted in pain and barely contained rage. Then he turned to Malcolm, studying the composed expression in front of him. "Mr. Johnson," Monroe said, "can you tell me what happened here?" Malcolm gave a slight nod. "They came here uninvited, shouted in my face, demanded I control my daughters. When I refused to bow, Malcolm gestured toward Richard, swung at me in front of my children. "And how did you respond?" Detective Monroe asked. "I stopped him," Malcolm replied, voice steady as stone. "I used nothing but defensive technique. I didn't strike. I didn't threaten. I simply didn't allow him to harm my family." Monroe was silent for a few moments. Then he turned to a younger officer beside him. "Check with the neighbors. I want to know who saw what." Victoria continued shouting behind him. "Neighbors? Are you joking? They're all on his side." But Monroe didn't turn. He took a few steps forward, his gaze now falling on Avery and Autumn, sitting calmly just inside the doorway. "You too. Did you witness anything?" Autumn answered, her voice firm and unwavering. "We were behind him. We didn't interfere. But I saw it clearly. He punched our father first. No warning. No reason. And our dad didn't go too far. He just defended himself." Avery followed, her eyes sharp and direct. "And at school? They started that, too. They humiliated us, harassed us, physically, before we ever responded. The hallway cameras will prove everything." Monroe raised an eyebrow, like he'd just found a missing puzzle piece. "There are cameras?" "Crestmoor has full surveillance. Lined down every hallway." Avery confirmed. Monroe scribbled into his notebook. "Then I'll request the footage." Just then, an older man emerged from the house across the street, raising his phone. "I caught it all, Detective Monroe," he called. "From the moment they pulled up. You can see exactly who started what." Monroe stepped off the porch, took the phone, and reviewed the video carefully. After a few quiet minutes, he nodded, then turned back toward his officers. "Cuff Richard Whitmore. Charge him with aggravated assault and trespassing." "You can't do that," Victoria shrieked. "We're respected in this town." Monroe turned back, voice sharp as a blade. "And the law doesn't care who you are." Malcolm remained still. He didn't smile, but his eyes and the eyes of his 2 daughters said what they had always known. The truth can be buried, but when it rises, it brings everything with it. Detective Monroe returned to the interview room nearly an hour later. In his hand was a thick file folder, stuffed with printed security footage, written neighbor statements, and stills from the cell phone video taken by the man across the street from the Johnson home. He sat down without preamble. One by one, he laid out the pages. Screenshots from the video showed Richard Whitmore throwing the first punch, his face twisted with rage, not debating but commanding. There was also an image of Victoria, hands on her hips, mouth open mid-yell, standing on someone else's porch like it belonged to her. "We reviewed every statement," Monroe said, locking eyes with Malcolm. "From eyewitnesses to the neighbors' footage to the school's own cameras. And not one piece of evidence shows you or your daughters initiated anything." Autumn tilted her head slightly, a glint returning to her eyes. "What about Crestmoor?" Monroe nodded. "We've issued a warrant for the school's internal surveillance logs. The hallway footage is clear. Avery was shoulder checked first. Autumn was shoved. Your responses came after you were publicly assaulted, and they were clearly defensive." Avery sat straighter. "So we're not being charged?" Monroe shook his head. "No. In fact, based on the evidence, and now, several students coming forward, including footage of the locker graffiti, Chase Whitmore, Tyler Graves, and Logan Price are under investigation for harassment, school violence, and organized racial targeting." A heavy silence settled over the room. Malcolm met Monroe's gaze. "What about the school?" he asked. "Will they be held accountable?" Monroe exhaled slowly, then nodded. "We're looking into it. If it's proven that the principal or any staff knew and did nothing, there will be legal consequences." Avery and Autumn exchanged a look. No words were needed. They both understood this wasn't over. But for the first time, justice hadn't looked away. In the room next door, Victoria Whitmore was still shouting, her voice no longer sharp, but shrill with panic. Richard sat slumped, shoulders sunken under the weight of something heavier than shame. Like the town itself was finally pressing back. Because for the first time in their lives, they didn't own the board. Monroe closed the folder, stood, and gathered the files. Before leaving, he turned back toward the Johnsons. "I don't know how far this will go," he said, "but I know this much, what the three of you did. Standing tall when the world expected you to fall. That means something, especially in a place like this." Malcolm nodded. He didn't smile, but there was something in his eyes, something deeper than gratitude, a quiet conviction that justice, even when late, could still choose the side of what's right. Friday morning sunlight streamed to the towering windows of Crestmoor Academy as it always did. But this time, the air inside no longer carried the usual chill. Students' footsteps echoed more softly, more cautiously. The false pride that once blanketed the school now bore a visible fracture, like the glaze on fine porcelain, cracked under the heat of truth. In the main conference room, soft light from a crystal chandelier bathed the long oak table below. At its head, Dr. Collier, principal of Crestmoor, sat upright, his usually stern face pulled taut beneath the weight of shame. In front of him, a thick investigative report from the city police, student testimonies, stills from school surveillance footage. Across the table sat Malcolm Johnson, flanked by his daughters, Avery and Autumn. Their presence was quiet but undeniable. Three people who walked through a storm and were still standing. Dr. Collier cleared his throat, his hands clenched tightly, trying to hold on to dignity he no longer owned. After receiving the full report from city investigators and cross-referencing it with our internal data, he hesitated, avoiding Malcolm's gaze. "We formally apologize to the Johnson family, and especially to Avery and Autumn, for failing to protect you as we are obligated to do as an educational institution." The room seemed to freeze in place. "The suspension placed on you has been rescinded immediately," he continued, "and the disciplinary board has reached a unanimous decision. The three students involved, Chase Whitmore, Tyler Graves, and Logan Price, are to be permanently expelled for gross violations of the school's code of conduct and anti-discrimination policies." Malcolm nodded. No expression, no anger, just a simple nod, like a man hearing a decision that should have been made long ago. Dr. Collier exhaled, then turned to the girls. "I know no apology can undo what you endured here, but I give you my word, Crestmoor will no longer be a place that protects silence." Avery held his gaze. "Are you saying that because the press is watching, or because you finally believe it?" Autumn glanced at her sister, then looked back at Collier. "We didn't need your protection. We protected ourselves. What we need is for you to protect the ones who come after us." Collier paused, and this time he nodded slowly, heavily, as if understanding that their words weren't a request, but a condition for rebuilding trust. Before leaving the room, He stood and bowed his head slightly, a gesture he had never offered any student before. As the three Johnsons stepped out into the hallway, silence fell like a curtain. A few students pressed themselves against the walls, their eyes meeting the girls', then quickly looking away. There were whispers now, but no more laughter, no mocking glances, only quiet recognition for those who had walked through fire and emerged still standing tall. They didn't need fanfare. They didn't need applause. But from that moment on, Avery and Autumn were no longer those two scholarship girls. They were the ones the entire school could no longer ignore. October passed, and the crisp autumn air carried something new, the scent of dry leaves, cold wind, and change. The courtyard at Crestmoor Academy, once a battlefield of sharp glances and sharper whispers, had grown quieter, more cautious, not out of fear, but because someone had finally shattered the unspoken rules that used to govern it. Avery and Autumn still walked the same halls as always, back straight, eyes steady, uniforms perfectly pressed. But what had changed wasn't them. It was how everyone looked at them. The students who once mocked them now dipped their heads slightly as they passed. The teachers who used to skim over their names now paused with intention when calling roll. And in class, no one dared interrupt when Avery raised her hand. No one cut Autumn off when she spoke. Not out of fear, but out of respect. They weren't heroes, and they'd never needed the title. But they had won, without ever losing themselves to rage. On a quiet weekend afternoon, Malcolm Johnson stood in the backyard, holding a mug of warm tea, watching his daughters train like they always did. The punching bag swayed rhythmically under Avery's solid strikes. Autumn moved fluidly across the mats, adjusting her stance, breathing evenly. "Every strike looks clean," Malcolm said as they paused, their faces glistening with sweat. Avery smiled, dabbing her forehead with a towel. "We didn't win with the strike, Dad." "No," Malcolm nodded. "You won with something most weak men will never understand. Control, discipline, and resolve." Autumn sank onto the wooden bench, gazing up at the sky. "If we had lost control that day, if we had fought just to get even, maybe we wouldn't be sitting here now." Malcolm set his cup down, his eyes steady on his daughters, not just with pride, but with deep, unshakable trust. "You stood up," he said softly, "not to prove you were stronger than them, but to show the world that when they try to corner you, you can still step forward on your own terms, without yelling, without bowing." That evening, the three of them sat beneath the crimson maple tree in the backyard. No one said much, but they all knew a new chapter had begun. And from this day forward, no one would ever define them by stares, by whispers, or by the weight of a prejudice passed down through generations. They hadn't fought for revenge. They stood up to remind the world, when the quiet ones must rise, even the storm will take pause. And from that day on, when people at Crestmoor whispered the name Johnson, they no longer thought the scholarship twins. They just said, "Don't mess with them unless you're ready to face yourself."